An Ofcom ruling last week decided that, while still with GBNews, presenter Mark Steyn made, and these are Ofcom's words, not mine, potentially harmful and materially misleading claims about the COVID jabs. GBNews responded saying Mark was right to ask tough questions and point out government inconsistencies, that he drew a reasonable conclusion from the data, but only one conclusion, and that if you had made that clear, there would have been no breach of Ofcom rules. But when it comes to materially misleading information, I would ask why other channels are not challenged when, for example, they say the jabs are safe and effective without having to reflect the view of eminent physicians and scientists who say the jabs are anything but. I'm going to discuss this with Emma and Jacob. Emma, do you see where I'm coming from? That the Ofcom seem to have created an uneven playing field.
Yeah, completely. I think, I mean, a lot of the words that are used in the Ofcom guidance, words like harmful, harm, reasonable, even due, as a way, these are quite vague and open to interpretation. So when Ofcom do investigations, in hindsight, they're looking into to some degree interpreting what exactly those words mean. And so when previously, say, other channels had content removed online, or, because something they'd said was regarded as misleading because it contradicted the current government health guidelines. I think the issue there is that if you have a channel, say the BBC, talking about the efficacy of masks, but ignoring, other evidence that they may want to, they could bring into the conversation, that they're having a partial discussion, but it's sort of dressed up as impartiality. And so it seems that is actually quite open to interpretation. And I think that perhaps, particularly in some of the mainstream broadcasters, and this goes back to our discussion about Gary Lineker, I think that there is a lack of self-awareness about partiality and bias, because perhaps they are siloed and they're in a bubble. And like you say, there are eminent scientists, because science is a discussion. That's the nature of science. People disagree about things. And even if there is a huge consensus on one particular area, whether it's climate or public health policy, there will be, marginal voices who are not completely wackadoodle, but who should be included in those discussions. But they're not, because I think they have this sort of unperceived bias.
Jacob, it struck me very early on that there were contrary voices that wanted to say other things and ask other questions, but it was always possible in other we all watched other channels rehearsing these lines about the jabs are fantastic, they're 100% safe, they're so effective, if you get them you won't get ill. By that time there were doctors and other scientists who were saying, well, possibly not the case. And there was no obligation pushed by Ofcom that those other voices ought to be heard alongside unsubstantiated claims about safety and efficacy. That really infuriated me.
Well, I think, so first I think you kind of got to separate the BBC out from this discussion a little bit, because you can understand that a broadcaster that we're all effectively forced to pay for probably has some obligations to due impartiality and all the rest of it. We put that to one side. Another thing, I'd kind of like to take a little step back and think about how the role of journalism has fundamentally been transformed over a period of time, where journalists, especially those who have kind of bigger platforms, think that they have a certain responsibility to push, as almost like we're in a kind of permanent state of wartime, where they have a responsibility to push whatever it is that they've decided is in the national interest, whether it's the importance of staying at home and isolating, or whether it's the importance of challenging the kind of government's immigration policy.
That's not journalism, is it?
No, and that's why I say it's a fundamental transformation of what the proper role of journalism is. And lots of journalists now think of themselves as having this responsibility to their real constituency, which is kind of whatever the kind of good and right and rigorous thing is to kind of push, rather than thinking, hey, it's our job to trust the viewers to make an informed decision if we provide some interesting viewpoints. That also, of course, includes an obligation not to entertain cranks and crazy people and to challenge everybody who comes onto your show, and that kind of aspiration to say we trust the public to make their minds up. That's what journalists should aim for.
Do we need Ofcom? Other countries operate without such an entity.
I don't know enough about it, I think, to say whether or not we should scrap it, but I certainly I think it's important to keep standards up in journalism, but I'm not sure that Ofcom have succeeded in doing that for the reasons that you've just described. And I think that journalism has been sort of transformed into something that probably wouldn't be recognisable to journalists, say, 50 years ago, the sorts of standards
10
they
years
kept.
ago.